The teamster on the mail sleigh did not get down. He looked at the broken wheel, the tilted wagon, the man lying in the back with blood darkening the cloth around his ribs, and the woman standing beside them in a wind that had already erased the road behind her. He could take one passenger, not two, not the horse, not the wagon. The woman shook her head before he finished the offer. Behind her, half buried in a drift against a granite cut, a rusted iron cylinder caught the last of the afternoon light. The teamster followed her gaze and understood what she was considering. His voice went flat. "That is a coffin," he said, "with rivets." The wagon axle had been cracking for 2 miles before it gave. Nettie Rourke heard it first as a low groan beneath the bed planks, the sound of iron flexing where iron should not flex. She pulled Bracken to a halt and climbed down to look, and the left rear hub separated from the spoke ring with a noise like a knuckle popping loose from its joint. The wheel folded inward. The wagon dropped onto its corner, and Edwin Kello slid hard against the sideboards and made a sound she had not heard from him before, a wet, compressed bark, like a man trying to cough through a closed door. It was 10 minutes past 2 on the afternoon of February 9th, 1899, 6 wagon miles from South Pass City. The sky to the east had disappeared, not darkened. Disappeared. Where an hour ago there had been a gray line of ridgeback and a strip of open sage, there was now a wall the color of dirty wool, moving west fast enough that Nettie could watch its edge consume the valley floor. The wind had not arrived yet, but she could hear it. A low hum rolling across the frozen ground ahead of the cloud, the kind of sound that reached the body before the ears made sense of it. Kello gripped the wagon rail with both hands and tried to sit upright. The binding around his ribs had darkened again, 2 cracked ribs from the timber skid at the Snowcap prospect 3 days earlier, and now the fall had reopened whatever had just begun to hold. "How far?" he asked. 6 miles. He looked at the wheel, then at the sky, then at her. He did not ask the next question. He did not need to. 6 miles to South Pass City, less than 3 hours of usable daylight, and the wall to the east would swallow what remained long before dusk. One horse already lathered beneath its winter coat, one man who could not walk 300 yards without stopping, 2 wool blankets, a canvas wagon cover with 3 patched seams, 19 pounds of food, salt pork, hard biscuit, a sack of dried beans, a pint and a half of kerosene, no stove, no timber, no second horse, and a piece of paper pinned beneath a stone in the wagon box, written in Merritt Copley's hand, claiming that everything Nettie owned belonged to him. She had $8.35 in her coat pocket. Copley's mine owed her $31.40 in wages he had never paid. Her left wrist, the one that never healed right after the fall 2 years ago, was already swelling inside the glove from the effort of controlling Bracken on the frozen road. By morning, she would not be able to close that hand around a tool handle. Nettie Rourke was 31 years old, born in Brownville, Nebraska, the daughter of a wheelwright who taught her to measure before she could read. She had learned harness repair at 9, simple joinery at 12, and how to balance a load across an uneven axle before her father trusted her with a team. After his death, she worked as a boarding house cook in a series of Wyoming mining camps, then as a ledger clerk when the camp foreman realized she could add faster than he could. 5 months ago, her husband had died of pneumonia in a canvas tent outside the Snowcap prospect, leaving her with the horse, the wagon, and a stack of promises from Merritt Copley that had already turned to paper. She had no children, no relatives in Wyoming, no passage money east. The only person in the territory who treated her as something other than camp labor was lying in the back of a broken wagon with blood soaking through his shirt. She would not leave him. That was the simple fact at the center of everything that followed. Not courage, not frontier grit, not some grand philosophy of survival. Edwin Kello had looked at her 2 years ago and seen a person who measured before acting, who admitted what she did not know, who checked an invoice because the recorded weight exceeded what the axle could carry. He had responded to that with respect, had asked her to check his material lists, had shown her how a boilermaker reads a rivet pattern through sound and rust, had taught her the difference between a sealed space and a ventilated one. Every other man in camp treated her as a cook who occasionally did sums. Kello treated her as someone worth teaching. Now his ribs were broken and the sky was closing, and Nettie could not carry him 6 miles through what was coming. She unhitched Bracken and tied him to the strongest remaining spoke. The horse stamped twice and turned his rump toward the east, which meant the wind was already reaching him in gusts she could not yet feel at ground level. The sound from the east grew louder. Calvin DeWitt's mail sleigh appeared on the road 20 minutes later, runners hissing on the frozen crust. DeWitt was 54 years old, built like a fence post wrapped in wool, and he had driven freight and mail across the South Pass region for 23 winters. He knew every draw, every exposed shoulder, every place where the wind funneled between granite cuts and turned a crosswind into something that could push a loaded wagon sideways off the road. He pulled up beside the broken wagon and did not get down. He looked at the wheel, the tilted box, the injured man, the horse, the sky. "How long ago?" he asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. DeWitt studied the eastern wall. It had moved closer while they spoke. "I can take you," he said. "Not him, not the horse, not the wagon. I'm loaded past my runners and I have mail for the city that is already 2 days late." Nettie shook her head. DeWitt removed his hat and rubbed the frozen edge of one ear. A gesture she would later learn meant he was calculating time and distance in a way that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with arithmetic. "Your axle is gone," he said. "Your canvas has 3 patched seams. I can see the thread pulling on the nearest one from here. You have no stove and no timber within a mile of this spot. 6 miles might as well be 60 after dark, and dark is coming whether you stand here arguing or not." "I am not arguing," Nettie said. "I am staying." "With what?" She did not answer immediately. Her eyes had moved past DeWitt's sleigh, past the road, to the mining spur that branched off toward the abandoned snowcap workings. The district was scattered with debris from decades of boom and bust. Old shafts, collapsed head frames, rusted equipment half buried in tailings. South Pass City and Atlantic City had grown from the Sweetwater gold rush and then contracted as the veins thinned, leaving a landscape littered with the skeletons of ambition. Machinery, iron fittings, timber scraps, and storage tanks lay where the last operators had dropped them. One of those tanks sat 50 yards from the wagon, half buried in a drift that had built against a granite cut. It was a riveted iron cylinder, roughly 10 feet long and 5 feet in diameter, open at one end where a corroded circular plate had been removed. Rust streaked the visible upper curve. A pipe fitting jutted from the crown near the closed end, broken off at the collar. DeWitt followed her gaze and understood immediately. "No," he said, "I have not said anything. You are looking at that tank the way a person looks at a boat when they cannot swim. I have seen iron in January. I have put my hand on a rail coupling at 20 below zero and left skin on it. Metal in a Wyoming storm does not protect a body. It draws the warmth out faster than canvas, faster than timber, faster than anything except standing in the wind itself." He pointed at the tank with the handle of his whip. "Iron in a Wyoming storm is a coffin with rivets." The words hung in the cold air between them. Nettie heard them and felt the truth in them. She knew what bare metal did in deep cold. She had watched a teamster's fingers bond to a steel chain at the snow cap and seen the blisters that remained after someone poured warm water to free him. Iron conducted heat with brutal efficiency. A bare iron shell in a storm would drain a body's warmth faster than the air alone. DeWitt was not wrong, but he was not seeing what she was seeing. "Turn the wagon on its side," he said. "Crawl beneath it. The box will block the direct wind. Pack snow against the windward face. That is your best chance without a stove and timber." Nettie looked at the wagon. Its canvas cover presented a broad, flat surface to the crosswind, a sail that would catch every gust and transmit the force into the already damaged frame. Drifting snow would pile against it, collapse the patched seams, and bury whatever lay beneath in a coffin of wet, wind-compressed white. The box was cracked at 2 joints. It would not hold its shape under load. "The canvas will catch the wind," she said. "The box is broken. If the drift builds against the flat side, it will fold." "Maybe," DeWitt said. "Maybe not. Either way, it is better than climbing inside bare iron and waiting for the cold to find you." He replaced his hat and gathered the reins. "I will tell them in town. If the road holds until morning, someone may come with a team. If it does not hold—" He looked at Kello, whose eyes were closed but whose chest still moved in short, careful pulls. "I am sorry. I do not have room." The sleigh moved on. The runners cut 2 thin lines into the crust, and the wind erased them within a minute. Nettie stood alone on the road with a broken wagon, an injured man, a tired horse, and 6 miles of nothing between her and the nearest warm room. The wall to the east had reached the near ridge. She could feel the temperature changing, not a slow decline, but a step, like walking from a cold room into a colder one. The air moved differently against the skin of her face, sharper, thinner. She turned toward the tank. The memory arrived without permission, the way such things do when the body recognizes a problem before the mind has named it. She was 9 years old, standing in her father's workshop in Brownville. December. Her father held a lit candle near the seam where the workshop door met its frame. The flame bent sideways, not from a gust, but from a steady, invisible river of cold air bleeding through the gap. "Put your hand here," he said. She pressed her palm near the seam and felt the cold moving across her knuckles, a current as definite as water. Then he placed her other hand flat against the wall 2 feet from the seam. The wall was cold, but the cold was still. It sat in the wood like a weight. It did not move. "Cold is one thing," her father said. "Moving cold is another. You can stand a cold wall. You cannot stand a cold wind. The wall holds its cold. The wind takes your warmth and carries it away, and it never stops taking." He closed the gap with a strip of leather and a tack. The candle flame straightened. The air near the seam went still. "You did not make the room warmer," she said. "No, I stopped the room from getting colder." Years later, in the boiler house at the snow cap, Kello had shown her the same principle from the other direction. After a heavy snowfall, the boiler house stayed warmer than it should have. Not because snow created heat, but because the snow banked against the lower walls slowed the escape of whatever warmth the boiler produced. The building's heat loss dropped because the insulating layer reduced the rate at which warm air inside traded places with cold air outside. He had said it plainly. Snow does not make heat. Snow makes heat stay. Nettie walked to the tank. She placed one mitten against the exposed upper shell and felt the cold bite through immediately. DeWitt was right about that. The iron was already approaching air temperature, and air temperature was falling. Then she drove her shovel 3 feet into the leeward face of the drift that had built against the granite cut. Beneath the wind-hardened crust, the snow was dry and granular, light, full of trapped air. The roar of the wind, which had become a constant pressure against her ears, muted as her arms sank deeper. At 3 feet, the silence was startling. She pulled her arm out and looked at her mitten. The snow that clung to it was not wet. It was powder. Dry snow was a poor conductor. She did not know the numbers. She did not know that researchers would one day measure dry snow near a density of zero point 0.2 grams per cubic centimeter and find thermal conductivity in the range of zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2 watts per meter Kelvin. She did not know the language, but she knew what her hand had just told her. The wind could not reach through 3 feet of dry snow, and if the wind could not reach the iron could not give the warmth away. DeWitt's coffin was not wrong. A bare iron tank in a storm would kill, but a buried iron tank, sealed from the wind, wrapped in snow, with the air inside held still, was something else entirely. She walked back to the wagon. Kello had opened his eyes. "The tank," she said. "No." His voice was flat. "Iron has almost no insulating value. You would freeze against the shell before midnight. I'm not going to leave it bare." He looked at her. The pain in his ribs had turned his face gray, but his eyes were focused. "Tell me," he said. She told him. "Dig a cradle into the drift, 8 feet deep. Leave 3 feet of snow above the crown. Roll the tank into the cavity with the closed end deepest. Face the open end toward the leeward side of the granite cut. Tilt it slightly toward the entrance so condensation would run away from the bedding. Build a platform 12 inches above the bottom from wagon sideboards, feed sacks, and folded harness pads. Because the floor of the tank would be the coldest surface, and sleeping against it would drain a body as surely as the wind. Hang the wagon canvas across the opening as a double curtain rather than an airtight seal. Leave a narrow gap at the bottom for air intake. Push a 2-inch vent through the broken pipe fitting at the crown, using a brake rod and a length of tin pipe so warm, wet air could escape upward through the snow. Keep the lamp in a sand-filled metal pan hung from the shell, away from the canvas and the bedding. Kello listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "The vent. If it plugs with frost, how do you clear it?" "A second rod, alongside the pipe. I can drive it from inside." He was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed against the canvas above him, and the patched seam nearest his head groaned. "You cannot seal it," he said. "If you seal it and light the lamp, you will not smell the danger. The gas has no color and no scent. A steady flame does not mean the air is safe." "I know." "You need 2 openings before one flame, always." "I know." He shifted against the sideboards and winced. Blood had seeped through the binding again. "The tank weighs more than 1,000 pounds, he said. "You have 1 horse and a wrist that will not close by morning." "I have a pulley." "You do not have a pulley." Orrin Bale left one. Orrin Bale arrived 15 minutes after DeWitt, driving a pair of freight mules pulling an empty sleigh back toward town. He was 36, a teamster by trade, and he had the careful eyes of a man who calculated loads and distances before he calculated feelings. He looked at the broken wagon, the injured man, the approaching wall of cloud, and the woman standing beside a rusted tank with her shovel still in her hand. "DeWitt told me," he said. "I passed him on the grade. He said you would not come." "No." Orrin climbed down and walked to the tank. He put his hand on the shell, pulled it back, and wiped the frost from his glove. "I have carried freight through storms that killed horses standing," he said. "The men who survived had timber walls and a fire. The men who did not—" He paused. "You understand what you are proposing?" "I understand what the alternative is." He walked around the tank, tapped the upper curve with his knuckle, studied the pipe fitting, the open end, the way the drift had built around the lower half. "With a team, perhaps," he said. With 3 men and a good anchor, you could roll it in an hour. With 1 horse and that wrist, you will still be turning the first rivet when the road closes. Nettie picked up the rope from the wagon. She looped it once around the tank's circumference, crossing the thickest reinforcing ring. The wrap converts Bracken's straight pull into rotation, she said. The tank does not need to be dragged. It needs to roll. Orrin watched the demonstration. His expression shifted, not to belief, but to something closer to professional attention. He saw the geometry. A rope wrapped around a cylinder and pulled from one end would rotate the cylinder rather than slide it, provided the friction between the rope and the shell held. The tank did not need to move as a dead weight. It needed to turn. The strongest objection is not the weight, he said. It is the crossing, 40 feet of broken ground between the tank and the drift. If the shell rolls sideways on the grade, it will break the horse's legs. If it enters the trench too fast, it will crush you or collapse the snow. I know. He studied her for a moment longer. Then he walked to his sleigh, unhooked a 2-sheave block and 30 feet of manila rope, and set them on the ground beside the tank. I expect this back, he said, and I expect to find you alive to return it. He climbed onto his sleigh and gathered the reins. Orrin, she said. He waited. Thank you. He shook his head. Do not thank me. I think you're wrong. I think that tank will freeze you and the old man both. But I have been wrong before, and you have that look. What look? The look of a person who has already decided. I cannot talk you out of a decision. I can only make sure you have rope. He drove on. The mules leaned into the traces, and the sleigh hissed away toward town. Nettie stood in the road with a block, a rope, a shovel, a dying man, a tired horse, and an idea that every experienced person she had met that afternoon told her was wrong. The wall to the east reached the road. The first gust hit Bracken broadside, and the horse staggered. Merritt Copley arrived 20 minutes later, which meant he had been watching from the snow-capped spur and waiting until Nettie was alone. He brought 2 freight hands on a heavy sleigh loaded with tools and fittings stripped from the closed prospect. Copley was 48, a freight contractor who leased mining claims the way other men leased storefronts, not to work them, but to own the right to charge others for access. The snow-capped prospect had failed under his management, but the lease remained active, and everything on the property belonged to the lease, including, he claimed, the tank. That is mine scrap, he said. He did not dismount. He looked down at Nettie from the sleigh seat with the expression of a man reviewing an inventory discrepancy. Part of the snow-cap equipment manifest. Riveted tank, iron, approximately 10 foot. I have the listing. That tank has been sitting in a ditch for 3 years, Nettie said. No one has touched it, moved it, or claimed it. Claiming it now. You are claiming a rusted shell that you left in the weather because you were too cheap to haul it to scrap, and you are claiming it at the moment I need it to keep a man alive. Copley's face did not change. He reached into his coat and produced a ledger, not the mine's ledger, but a personal accounting book with Nettie's name on a marked page. While we are discussing what belongs to whom, he said, your board and lodging at the Snowcap exceeded your earned wages by $14.60. Your wagon and horse secure that debt until it is paid. My wages were $31.40. You never paid them. Wages were applied against expenses. The balance is what I've written. Nettie looked at the ledger. She knew the numbers were fabricated. She had kept her own records, but Copley's ledger was the one that would be presented to a justice, and Copley's word carried the weight of a man who owned equipment and employed men. That tank is worth scrap, Copley said. Your wagon is worth debt. By morning, I expect both will belong to me. Then you had better hope I am alive to dispute the figures, Nettie said. Copley studied her. Behind him, one of his freight hands looked away, not at the sky, not at the road, but at the ground directly in front of his boots. The gesture of a man who knew something unfair was happening and had decided that keeping his job required him not to see it. You are free to walk to town, Copley said. I would not recommend remaining here with stolen property and an injured man in what is coming. He ordered his men not to help. The sleigh moved on toward the snow-capped spur, runners cutting fresh lines in the crust. Nettie watched it go. The wind pressed against her back now, steady and growing. She could feel the temperature dropping, not gradually, but in layers, as if the air were being replaced by something denser and colder with each gust. Calvin DeWitt's assessment, Orrin Bale's doubt, Copley's threat, 3 men, 3 verdicts, and every one of them pointed toward the same conclusion. The woman with the broken wagon and the rusted tank was making a mistake that the storm would correct by morning. If she failed, the story told in South Pass City would be simple. An inexperienced woman ignored men who understood winter. She crawled inside a metal cylinder, and the cold found her there, and in the spring someone would pry open the frozen canvas and find what the storm had left. Kello's breathing had become shallow, short pulls that did not fill his chest. The cloth around his ribs was dark and stiff. The wagon canvas snapped hard enough to tear another seam. Nettie picked up the shovel and walked toward the drift. Tell us in the comments, have you ever kept building after everyone around you had already decided you would fail? The work began at 2:40 in the afternoon. By the time she drove the first shovel blade into the drift, the eastern wall had swallowed the road behind her, and the wind was steady enough to lean against. She started with the tank. The lower half sat in a shallow depression between 2 ridges of frozen tailings, pinned by gravel and 3 years of settled frost. She cleared the near side first, working the shovel beneath the reinforcing ring where the shell met the ground. The frozen crust resisted the blade. Each stroke jarred her left wrist, and by the 10th stroke the joint had begun to swell inside the glove. She switched hands, drove the shovel with her right, and used her left to brace the handle. Slower, but she could feel the steel meeting softer ground beneath the frost line. Kello could not stand, but he could listen. Tap the shell, he said from the wagon, each ring with the hammer. She took the small ball peen from the tool roll and struck the first riveted course near the ground. A clear ring traveled the length of the plate and reflected off the closed end. Good, Kello said. That section is carrying evenly. Move down. She struck the next course, the same clear tone. The third course, near the lowest seam where the shell had sat in mud and water for 3 years, produced a dull thud that died within a foot of the strike point. Heavy corrosion, Kello said. The plate is thinned. Do not route the rope across that section. Find the intact reinforcing rings and cross them. The rivet heads will grip the rope. The corroded plate will tear. This was how he taught, not in lectures, not in summaries, but in the specific moment when the knowledge mattered. He did not explain the metallurgy of corrosion. He told her where to put the rope. She wedged the wagon jack beneath the sound ring on the upper side and cranked the handle until the shell lifted 1.5 inches, enough to slide greased harness leather and 2 flat stones beneath it as a bearing surface. The tank needed to break free of the ground before it could roll. The jack foot sat on frozen crust over soft ground. On the 4th pump of the handle, the foot punched through. The jack dropped. The tank shifted. The reinforcing ring nearest Nettie's left hand snapped downward and caught 2 fingers of her glove between the iron and the stone. Pain shot from her fingertips to her elbow. She wrenched her hand free and stumbled backward. The glove was intact, but the 2 smallest fingers on her left hand had gone white. She could not feel them. She pressed them against her stomach beneath her coat and waited while the blood returned in a burning rush that made her eyes water. The tank had settled back into its depression. The jack lay on its side in the broken crust. She reset the jack on a wider stone, pumped it again, and did not put her hands near the ring until the shell was stable. By 3:20, the tank was free on one side. The near face of the drift was 40 feet away. 40 feet of broken ground, 1,000 pounds of iron, one horse, one pulley, less than 2 hours before the light failed completely. She began cutting the snow cradle. The drift had built against the granite, cut over multiple storms, compressing and layering until the base was dense and the upper face was wind-hardened crust over softer granular snow. Nettie drove the shovel into the leeward face below the lip and began excavating a trench wide enough to accept the tank's 5-foot diameter plus a foot of clearance on each side. She worked from memory and from Kello's instructions, shouted over the rising wind. "Never undercut the entire roof at once," he called. "Remove snow in short bays. Leave a rib between each bay until you're ready to set the shell. If you take the roof in one pass, the weight above will collapse into the trench, and you will dig the same snow twice." She cut in 5-foot bays, leaving 18-inch ribs of packed snow between them. After each bay, she pushed a sharpened wagon rod upward through the roof to measure thickness. Anything under 36 inches, 3 feet long, she marked and avoided. The rod would not measure insulating value, but 3 feet of dry snow above the shell was the minimum she and Kello had agreed on. Less than that, and the wind might find the iron. At 3:45, the crust fractured. A 6-foot span of wind-hardened surface broke along a seam she had not seen, and 300 pounds of dense snow dropped into the trench and filled half the excavation she had just completed. She stood in a waist-deep hole, looking at an hour of work buried beneath a slab. She dug it out. The same snow moved twice. Her shirt froze stiff across her back, where sweat had soaked through the wool. The fabric crackled when she moved her shoulders. By 4:15, the trench was half complete, 8 feet deep at the far end, rising slightly toward the entrance. The rise was deliberate. The main chamber would sit above the entrance, so the coldest air would settle toward the opening rather than pooling around the occupants. 28 feet still separated the tank from the trench. Nettie walked to the old hoist post buried among the tailings, a stump of mining timber 8 inches across, driven into rock and frozen solid. The lack of standing trees on the open shoulder of South Pass was part of the danger. Without that single piece of mining debris left behind by miners who had no further use for it, she would have had nothing to anchor the pulley. She bolted Oren's 2-sheave block to the post with a lag screw from the wagon tool roll. Then she wrapped the manila rope around the tank, crossing 2 intact reinforcing rings the way Kello had told her, routed the free end through the block, and hitched Bracken to the pulling line. The angle was critical. She positioned the horse so his pull would run roughly parallel to the ground and slightly uphill of the tank's center of gravity. The wrap around the shell would convert the straight pull into rotation. The tank would turn on its own curve rather than sliding as a dead weight across the frozen ground. She hitched Bracken low, close to the ground, so the force would pull the base of the tank toward the trench rather than dragging the top forward. "Walk," she said. Bracken leaned into the harness. The rope tightened. The fibers creaked against the reinforcing ring. The tank did not move. "Walk," she said again, and slapped the trace. Bracken strained. The rope bit into the iron. A low groan came from the shell as the frozen gravel beneath it compressed. The tank rotated 8 inches and stopped. A protruding pipe fitting on the lower side struck a buried rock, and the impact tore the fitting free of the shell with a sound like a nail being pulled from green wood. A ragged hole 2 inches across, opened in the iron plate. Nettie stared at the hole. A piece of the shelter's wall had just been ripped away. The shell was now breached. From the wagon, Kello's voice came thin and strained. "Do not plug it." She turned. "That hole is your upper exhaust," he said. "If you can turn the shell so that hole faces the crown when the tank is buried, you have a vent you did not have to drill. The pipe was corroded. The plate around it is still sound." She looked at the hole, then at the tank's orientation. If she continued rolling in the same direction, the hole would end up near the top of the closed end, exactly where the warm, moist air would collect inside the buried shelter. She reset the rope lower and called Bracken forward again. The wind was no longer gusting. It was constant. The sound had changed from intermittent pressure to a single sustained note, like a hand pressed flat against a vibrating string. Snow moved across the ground in sheets that erased her footprints between the tank and the trench. The tank turned, 8 inches, 12. The rope held. The reinforcing rings gripped. 20 feet remained between the shell and the cradle, and the light was failing. She could not feel her left hand at all. At 5:10, the tank broke loose. Nettie had reset the rope 4 times, each time unwinding and rewinding the wrap to keep it centered on the intact reinforcing rings. Bracken had pulled in short efforts, 8 inches, 12 inches, a full rotation that covered 2 feet of ground before the shell caught on another piece of buried debris and stopped. Each time she cleared the obstacle, repositioned the rope, and called the horse forward again. The frozen ground between the tank and the trench was not level. It sloped downhill toward the drift at a grade she had not fully appreciated from the road. The first 30 feet had been uphill resistance, the tank fighting gravity, friction, and frozen tailings with every inch. But somewhere around the 20th foot, the ground leveled, and at the 28th foot it began to tip toward the excavated trench. She felt the change before she saw it. The rope went slack between pulls. Bracken's effort dropped. The tank began to move without instruction. Then it accelerated. The shell rolled over the lip of the grade and gained speed on the downhill face. 2 feet per second became 4. The rope whipped through the block, and the sheave screamed against the bolt. Nettie grabbed for the brake line, a second rope she had threaded through the spokes of the broken wagon wheel as a crude drag, and the manila burned across her right palm before she could set her grip. Her left wrist could not close. The joint had swollen past the glove seam, and the tendons refused the signal. She had one working hand on a rope attached to 1,000 pounds of iron rolling downhill toward a trench, a horse, and a granite wall. Bracken heard the sound behind him, the grinding rumble of iron on frozen ground, and sidestepped. The pulling rope tangled in the pulley housing. The block torqued against its bolt, and the hoist post bent 6 inches before the lag screw held. The tank veered. Its path shifted 15 degrees toward the horse. Kello moved. He should not have been able to. 2 cracked ribs, a reopened wound, and 6 hours of cold had turned his body into something that responded to commands only after the pain had been bargained with. But he rolled over the side of the wagon, landed on his knees in the frozen gravel, and threw his weight across the brake rope where it crossed a flat stone. The friction doubled. The rope bit into the stone. The tank slowed. Nettie drove a wooden wedge beneath the nearest reinforcing ring with a single strike of the hammer. Iron met wood, met frozen ground, and the shell stopped. Bracken's right rear hoof struck the tank's surface. The sound rang across the open ground like a bell hit with a mallet. The horse reared, came down, and stood trembling with his flank 6 inches from the riveted shell. Kello lay face down on the brake rope. When Nettie reached him, he coughed once, and blood appeared on the snow beneath his mouth. not a smear, a bright, articulate spot the size of a coin. Edwin! He did not lift his head. His breathing came in the same shallow pulls she had heard all afternoon, but faster now, with a wet undertone that had not been there before. Edwin, look at me. He turned his face sideways. His skin had gone from gray to white. His lips were the color of the sky. The tank stopped, he said. Yes. Where? She looked. The shell had come to rest 12 feet from the entrance of the snow trench. 12 feet of broken ground, a patch of exposed tailings, and then the ramp she had cut into the drift. Close, not close enough. 12 feet, she said. He closed his eyes. Do not stop, he said. You stop and we both die out here, and Copley writes whatever he wants in that ledger. She helped him back into the wagon. The blood on the snow froze before she could cover it. She wiped his mouth with a cloth that was already stiff with cold and old blood, and pressed his hands beneath the blanket. The wind had reached the pitch where it no longer came in gusts. It was a single, sustained force, a pressure against every exposed surface that did not relent between breaths. Snow traveled horizontally past the wagon at knee height, fast enough to sting exposed skin. The temperature had dropped through whatever floor the afternoon had offered and was falling into territory that no longer registered as cold. It registered as pain. Her cheeks burned. The skin around her eyes tightened. Each breath arrived with an edge, as though the air had been fitted with something sharp. The light was nearly gone. She laid the wagon tongue and 2 sideboards as rails from the tank's resting place into the trench. The boards were oak, 2 inches thick, scarred from years of freight hauling. She greased them with the last of the harness tallow and aligned them with the trench floor so the tank would roll along a guided track rather than sliding free across the snow. Bracken pulled in 6 short efforts. Each effort moved the shell 2 to 3 feet. Between pulls, Nettie repositioned the wedges, checked the rail alignment, and cleared loose snow that the wind had already begun pushing back into the trench. At 6:12, the closed end of the tank entered the drift. The sound changed immediately. The wind's roar, which had been a constant assault on every surface and every nerve, muffled as the shell moved deeper into the excavated cradle. The iron disappeared into the white wall 1 foot at a time, and with each foot the noise dropped. By the time the tank was halfway in, Nettie could hear her own breathing for the first time in an hour. At 6:35, only 18 inches of the open rim remained exposed. She worked fast because the light was gone, and she was working by feel. She packed loose snow around the sides of the shell, not ramming it into dense ice, but building it in layers, each layer slightly compressed by the flat of the shovel. Dense snow lost the air pockets that made it a poor conductor. She needed the snow to remain granular, full of trapped stillness. The upper vent came next. She drove the brake rod upward from inside the shell, through the ragged hole where the pipe fitting had torn free, and pushed until she felt the rod break through the surface of the drift above the crown. 3 feet of snow separated the top of the tank from the open air. She threaded a length of tin pipe alongside the rod and left both in place. The pipe for exhaust, the rod for clearing ice. She hung the wagon canvas across the opening as a double curtain, leaving a 6-inch gap at the bottom. The gap was the low intake. Cold air would enter along the floor. Warm air would rise and exit through the upper vent. The system would breathe, not comfortably, not safely, but it would breathe. The sleeping platform took the last of her strength. She laid wagon sideboards across the tank floor, 12 inches above the curved iron bottom, braced them on feed sacks stuffed with straw and folded harness pads. The gap between the platform and the shell floor was critical. The floor would be the coldest surface, the iron closest to the ground, farthest from the vent, where cold air pooled and body heat drained fastest. 12 inches of dead air between a sleeping body and that iron was the difference between waking up stiff and not waking up at all. She hung the lamp in a sand-filled metal pan from a wire looped over the interior reinforcing ring. The pan would catch any spill. The wire kept the flame away from the canvas and the bedding. She filled the lamp reservoir from the kerosene tin. A pint and a half was all she had, and set a match against the wick. The flame caught. Steady. Yellow. Clean. She brought Bracken around to the leeward side of the granite cut, where a natural depression and the overturned wagon box created a wind trench deep enough to protect the horse's body below the withers. She packed snow around the wagon box and tethered Bracken with a long line that ran from his halter through a ring bolt on the tank's exposed rim and back to the interior. If the horse pulled, she would feel it from inside. At 6:45, she helped Kello through the canvas curtain and onto the platform. He lay on the upper side, the side closer to the vent and the warmest air, and she covered him with both blankets. The wind outside had reached the state where Nettie could not distinguish it from silence. It was too loud, too constant, too enormous to register as sound. It was pressure. It was weight. It was the world leaning against every surface that dared to stand upright. Inside the tank, the canvas moved gently with each breath of air exchange. The lamp burned. At 7:15, Nettie pressed one hand against the naked iron beside the entrance, where only a few inches of snow covered the shell. The cold was immediate and vicious, the kind that reached through skin and found bone. Then she pressed the other hand against the wall deep inside the tank, where 3 feet of snow and the mass of the drift surrounded the iron. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between touching a stoveplate in winter and touching a clay jar. The buried wall was cool. It was not warm, but it was no longer pulling the heat from her hand at a rate that caused pain. "The snow is working," she said. Kello corrected her from the platform. His voice was thin but precise. "The iron is distributing your heat and the lamp's heat around the curve of the shell," he said. "It spreads warmth the way a pan spreads fire, but the snow is what slows the loss. Without the snow, the iron would give that heat to the wind as fast as you and the lamp could make it. With the snow, the heat has nowhere to go quickly, so it stays." This was the principle, not that iron was warm. Iron was never warm, but iron surrounded by insulation became a container instead of a conductor. The shell distributed whatever modest heat existed, 2 bodies, 1 small lamp, across its entire interior surface. The snow prevented that heat from escaping at the rate the wind demanded. The result was not comfort. It was the narrow, measurable gap between a survivable temperature and a lethal one. At 8 o'clock, she checked the readings. She had no proper thermometer, but Kello had taught her a field method, a cup of water set at different heights inside the shelter. Water at shoulder height had not frozen. Water near the platform's edge had formed a thin skin of ice. Water on the iron floor below the platform was solid. The gradient told her the system was working. Warm air rose and pooled at shoulder height. Cool air settled to the floor. The platform held the sleepers in the warm zone. The vent drew the warmest, wettest air out through the crown before it could condense and drip. Outside, the temperature had fallen through 0 and continued falling. She could not measure it. She did not need to. The sound of the wind told her enough. A roar that no longer varied in pitch or intensity. The sound of air moving at speeds that stripped heat from every exposed surface with the patience of something that never tired. Calvin DeWitt passing the site on his return from town with an empty sleigh, saw the last visible curve of the tank disappear beneath drifting snow. From the road, the drift looked unbroken. No structure, no shelter, no sign that two people were breathing 50 feet from where he sat. He pulled his collar tighter and drove on. The storm sound changed from gusts to one uninterrupted roar, and inside the buried shell, the lamp flames stood upright and still. The first assault came at 9 o'clock. Wind-driven snow had added nearly 2 feet around the exposed entrance rim. The canvas curtain, which had moved gently with each cycle of air exchange, went still. Not because the air had stopped moving, but because the gap at the bottom, the low intake, had packed with snow. Nettie felt it before she understood it. The air inside the tank became heavier. The lamp flame, which had burned with a clean yellow point for 2 hours, turned orange at the tip and began to leave a dark smudge on the glass. She kicked the canvas aside and drove the shovel into the packed snow at the base. 3 hard strokes opened a gap the width of her fist. Cold air rushed in along the floor, sharp enough to make her gasp. The temperature near her ankles dropped 15 degrees in seconds, but the flame turned yellow again. She rebuilt the curtain with a rigid stick sewn into the hem to keep the bottom edge from collapsing, and she angled a flat stone to direct incoming air downward along the floor rather than into the sleeping area. The modification cost her 20 minutes and most of the feeling in her right hand. Every 20 minutes after that, she pushed the vent rod upward through the crown. Each time it moved freely for the first few inches, then met resistance, new snow building over the outlet, then broke through into the open wind with a whisper of cold air dropping down the shaft. Each time, the resistance was slightly greater. Kello's fever rose at 11. He began speaking to someone who was not in the tank, a man named Pugh, a hoist operator from the Carissa mine who had died before Nettie arrived at South Pass. He asked Pugh whether the cable had been inspected and whether the sheave grease was rated for cold. Nettie moved him closer to the wall, where the iron's conductive surface spread the lamp's heat most evenly. She could not bring the fever down. She could only keep the air around him above the threshold, where shivering became something worse. His ribs made every breath a negotiation. Inhale too deep, and the cracked bone shifted. Inhale too shallow, and the lungs could not clear the fluid that was building from the injury and the cold and the effort of stopping the tank on the hill. She gave him the upper side of the platform, where the air temperature held near 25 degrees. A number she estimated from the water cup method, not a thermometer. 25 degrees was not warm, but it was 65 degrees warmer than the air outside. At midnight, the second assault arrived. The lamp turned orange again, not gradually, the way it had at 9 o'clock when the intake packed with snow. This time, the change was sudden, a shift from clean yellow to a dirty amber that left soot on the glass and a sweet metallic taste in the air that Nettie did not recognize as danger. Her head ached, not the sharp pain of cold, but a dull spreading pressure behind her eyes that felt like fatigue. She thought she was tired. She was tired. She had been working for 10 hours in conditions that would exhaust a healthy person in 3. But Kello's teaching surfaced through the fog. A steady flame does not guarantee safety. The gas has no color and no scent. Headache or unusual drowsiness must be treated as danger, not fatigue. She extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, the cold arrived like a physical weight. Without the flame, the air temperature dropped immediately. She could feel the iron shell begin to surrender the stored heat through the snow at a rate that would bring the interior to dangerous levels within an hour or 2. She probed the upper vent with the rod. It moved 6 inches and stopped. She pushed harder. The rod bent against something solid, not snow, but ice. The warm, moist air from the lamp and their breathing had traveled up the vent pipe and frozen where it met the cold air above the drift. A plug of ice had formed in the exhaust, sealing the shelter. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless. In an enclosed or semi-enclosed space, it accumulates without warning. The headache was the warning. The next stage would be confusion, then unconsciousness, then death. And at no point would the victim understand what was happening because the gas offered no signal the senses could detect. Nettie struck the rod with the hammer. Once. Twice. The third blow cracked the ice plug and the rod punched through into open air. Cold fell down the shaft in a column that hit her face like water. The temperature inside the tank dropped sharply. The warmth she had spent hours building bled upward through the cleared vent in seconds. But Kello's breathing changed. The shallow, careful pulls deepened. He coughed twice, and the congested sound in his chest cleared enough that she could hear air moving in both lungs instead of one. The headache began to lift. She relit the lamp 10 minutes later after the air had cycled. The flame burned clean. She set a schedule. Every 15 minutes, she would push the rod through the vent. If it met resistance, she would clear it immediately. She would not wait for the flame to change color. She would not trust the flame at all. 2 openings before 1 flame. She did not sleep. If you're invested in Nettie's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because opening that vent may have saved 2 lives, but the storm has not reached its coldest hour. The third assault came at 1:30 in the morning, and it did not come from the weather. The tether line leading from Bracken's halter through the ring bolt went slack. Nettie had been checking the line every half hour, tugging gently to feel the horse's weight on the other end. Bracken would shift his stance, and the line would tighten, a small reassurance that the animal was still standing, still alive, still sheltered behind the wagon box in the wind trench. At 1:30, the line moved freely. No resistance, no weight. She tied the interior end of the line to the tank's reinforcing ring, creating a guide rope that would lead her back to the entrance from wherever the wind carried her. Then she pushed through the canvas curtain and into the storm. The word for what met her did not exist in 1899. The Oxford English Dictionary's earliest evidence of the term whiteout dates to the 1930s. What Nettie experienced had no clinical name. It was snow moving so fast and in such volume that the distinction between ground and sky, between solid and air, between up and down, ceased to exist. She could not see her own hand. She could not feel which direction was level. The wind did not push her. It occupied her. It entered her clothing through every seam and gap, and began drawing heat from her body at a rate that she could measure in seconds. The air temperature had reached a dramatized local low near -40 degrees. The wind held at approximately 45 miles per hour. A modern calculation would place the wind chill near -86, a number that meant exposed skin could freeze in under 5 minutes, and that the rate of heat loss from an unprotected body exceeded the rate at which the body could produce warmth. The characters in the story did not calculate wind chill. They did not need to. The cold was not a number. It was an event. It was something that happened to the body the way a blow happens to the body, sudden, total, and impossible to negotiate with. Nettie followed the tether line hand over hand, each grip requiring her to open her fingers to the wind and close them around a rope that felt like frozen iron. Her left hand could not grip at all. She hooked the rope over her right forearm and pulled herself forward. The wagon box had shifted. One end had lifted from the snow trench, and the wind had driven it sideways, opening a gap in the wind shelter. Snow had poured through the gap and packed around Bracken's legs and muzzle. The horse was down, lying on his left side with his head turned away from the wind and snow compressed against his nostrils. He was breathing, but barely. The snow had formed a seal over his muzzle that restricted airflow to a narrow gap on the leeward side. Nettie cleared his nostrils with her bare right hand. The snow was not soft. It was wind-packed, dense, abrasive. It scraped her knuckles raw. She cut the tangled trace that had wrapped around the wagon box frame and pulled Bracken's head free. The horse surged upward. 1,300 pounds of animal, panicking, rising from the snow in a lunge that threw Nettie sideways into the wagon box. Her left wrist struck the edge of a sideboard, and the joint, already swollen past function, sent a signal through her arm that she later described as white. Not a color, but a quality of pain that erased everything else for 3 full seconds. She led Bracken into the deeper trench beside the tank, below the granite cut where the wind could not reach directly. The wagon box, repositioned and anchored with the shovel driven through a plank and into frozen ground, blocked the worst of the drift. The horse could not enter the tank, but the snow wall and the overturned box stopped the direct wind, and Bracken's body heat, even diminished, even stressed, would not be stripped away at the rate the open road demanded. She tightened the shelter rope around the repositioned box. Her left wrist failed completely. The hand opened and would not close. She finished the knot with her right hand and her teeth. The tether line led her back to the entrance. She crawled through the canvas. Inside, the air was 40 degrees warmer than the air she had just left. The lamp burned clean. The vent rod, which she had cleared before going out, was already building resistance at the tip. She cleared it. She checked Kello. His fever held, but he was breathing. She did not sleep. The fourth assault arrived at 3 in the morning. Something struck the canvas twice. Not the wind. The wind struck constantly and everywhere. This was a deliberate impact, concentrated on a single point, with a pause between strikes. Nettie pulled the canvas aside. Orrin Bale stood in the entrance trench. Or rather, Orrin Bale leaned against the snow wall of the entrance trench, because standing required a coordination of muscle and balance that his body had lost. His face was white except for 2 dark patches on his cheekbones, where the skin had begun to freeze. His right mitten was gone. His bare hand was curled against his chest, the fingers drawn inward like a claw. He did not speak. He stared at Nettie with an expression she recognized. Not confusion exactly, but the vacant, searching look of a man whose mind had begun to disconnect from the situation his body occupied. Hypothermia's cruelest stage was not the shivering or the pain. It was the moment when the brain surrendered its grip on the present, and the victim no longer understood that they were dying. Orrin. He blinked, focused, lost focus again. She pulled him through the canvas. He collapsed onto the platform beside Kello and did not move. She covered him with a second blanket and pressed his bare hand between her own, one working hand and one useless, until the fingers began to pink. His arrival created a problem she had not anticipated. 3 people now occupied a volume of less than 200 cubic feet. Their combined body heat would raise the temperature, saw 3 sources instead of 2. But their combined oxygen consumption would increase proportionally. 3 pairs of lungs drawing from the same air. 3 sets of exhalations adding moisture and carbon dioxide, and the residual products of metabolism to a space that was already operating at the margin of safe ventilation. She widened the low intake by 1/2 an inch, pulling the canvas bottom away from the snow and wedging a stick to hold the gap. More cold air entered along the floor. The platform temperature dropped 2 or 3 degrees. She rationed the lamp. 10 minutes burning, 20 minutes dark. During the burning periods, the shell absorbed heat and distributed it. During the dark periods, the snow insulation held the residual warmth, while the air exchange carried away the worst of the combustion products. The rhythm became the architecture of survival. 10 minutes of light and warmth, 20 minutes of darkness and cold. Clear the vent. Check the intake. Press a hand against the wall and feel whether the iron was distributing or draining. Orrin's coherence returned after 20 minutes. He lay on the platform and looked at the curved iron ceiling and the soot-marked lamp bracket and the vent pipe disappearing into snow. "My sleigh overturned," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of inflection. 3 miles east, the wind caught the box and put me over. The mules broke free. When? I do not know. An hour, maybe 2. How did you find the entrance? I followed the rope between the freight markers until the rope ended. Then I walked into the wind until I hit something solid. It was the granite cut. I followed the rock wall until I felt the snow change, packed differently around a shape. I hit the canvas by accident. He was quiet for a moment. My wagon shelter failed within an hour, he said. The blankets froze where the blowing snow entered through the seams. I could not keep the wind out. The canvas caught the drift and the box filled. I left because staying meant dying. He looked at the iron wall beside him. He pressed his palm against it, the buried section, 3 feet of snow between his hand and the storm. It is not cold, he said. It is cool, Nettie corrected. It is not cold because the snow will not let it be cold. Orrin pulled his hand back and stared at the faint warmth lingering on his palm. He did not say anything else for a long time. The 5th assault came at 4:15 and nearly ended everything. The entrance curtain, the doubled wagon canvas that served as both windbreak and thermal barrier, tore along an old patch where Nettie had sewn a repair 2 months earlier. The thread, frozen and brittle, snapped along 6 inches of seam, and the canvas separated. Wind entered the tank. Not a gust. Not a draft. A river of air at -40, moving at whatever speed the narrow entrance trench funneled it to, pouring across the platform and striking the far wall of the shell with enough force to blow the lamp flames sideways against the glass. Snow sprayed across the floor. The temperature dropped so fast that Nettie felt the moisture on her face freeze between one breath and the next. Kello gasped. Orrin rolled toward the wall. Nettie and Orrin held the torn canvas, while Kello, lying on his side with his ribs grinding against each other, talked them through the repair. "Harness needles," he said. "In the tool roll. The curved ones." Nettie found them by feel. Rawhide lacing, not thread. Thread freezes and snaps. Rawhide stretches when it freezes and tightens when it warms. Orrin held the torn edges together while Nettie drove the curved needle through both layers of canvas. Her right hand did the work. Her left hung at her side, the wrist a swollen joint that had stopped sending pain signals and started sending nothing. "You cannot make it airtight," Kello said. "You're not trying to seal the entrance. You're trying to slow the air. Take the feed sack, the empty one, and hang it inside the canvas as an overlapping inner flap. The air will hit the canvas, pass through the tier, then hit the sack and lose direction. By the time it reaches the platform, it will have slowed enough." They built a crooked vestibule, 2 layers of material, offset so that no straight line existed between the outside air and the interior. The repair did not stop the wind. It confused the wind. It forced the air to turn corners, lose speed, and arrive at the platform as a slow seep rather than a killing current. The fix took 45 minutes. During those 45 minutes, the interior temperature dropped to the edge of what the water cup method could measure. Every cup frozen solid, including the one at shoulder height that had remained liquid all night. After the repair, the lamp brought the platform back to survivable warmth within an hour. The measurable performance of the shelter, taken across the full duration of the crisis, told the story that the feelings could not. Outside, the air reached a dramatized minimum near minus 40 degrees. Winds held between 40 and 50 miles per hour through the worst hours. The February 1899 cold outbreak produced verified temperatures of minus 40 at Laramie, minus 45 at Sheridan, and minus 51 at Basin. Wyoming's official state record would eventually reach minus 66. The South Pass figures in this account are dramatized, but they sit within the documented range of that extraordinary outbreak. Inside the buried tank, the measurements told a different story. The iron floor 12 inches below the platform registered frozen water at every check, 0 degrees or below throughout the night. The platform itself, where 3 bodies lay and the lamp burned in its ration cycles, held between 24 and 29 degrees depending on the hour, the lamp status, and the vent schedule. The entrance, where the patched curtain met the drift, registered frozen solid at every check, a transition zone where the shelter's warmth surrendered to the storm's demand. The kerosene consumption was the number that would later make freighters recalculate their assumptions about winter fuel. Nettie started with 1.5 pints, or 24 fluid ounces. After 27 hours, she had burned approximately 14 ounces, operating the lamp intermittently for a total of roughly 9 hours of flame. 10 fluid ounces remained. The vent clearing schedule tightened through the night. During the worst drifting, the rod met ice resistance every 20 minutes. During calmer intervals, there were no calm intervals outside, but the drift settled at different rates depending on wind direction. The cycle stretched to 40 minutes. The snow cover above the crown increased from approximately 3 feet at installation to more than 5 feet by morning as wind-driven snow packed over the rounded surface of the drift. Each additional foot of snow added insulation. The storm, in effect, buried its own enemy deeper with every hour it raged. The gale did not skip over the shelter. It found no wall to strike. The wind hit the drift, found a rounded surface with no edges and no gaps, and flowed over and around it the way water flows around a stone in a stream. The force that destroyed canvas tents and overturned sleighs and pinned horses beneath collapsed shelters passed over the buried tank without purchase. From outside, the shelter was invisible, a featureless hump in a field of featureless white. Only the vent rod and the marker pole, a 12-foot length of wagon brake bar that Nettie had driven into the drift beside the vent before entering, stood above the surface. And by morning, the marker pole carried a 2-inch sleeve of packed ice that made it look like every other vertical remnant in the mining debris field. By 10 in the morning, Nettie had not slept. The lamp remained extinguished. 3 bodies held the upper air above 20 degrees without flame, a testament to the insulation's effectiveness and to the simple thermodynamic fact that 3 warm-blooded adults in a small enclosed space produce enough metabolic heat to maintain a survivable temperature gradient when the heat has nowhere to escape quickly. Kello slept. His breathing had worsened. The wet undertone had deepened, and each exhale carried a rattle that Nettie did not like, but the fever had stabilized rather than climbing, and his color had improved from white to gray. Orrin sat against the wall with his bare hand wrapped in a strip of blanket and his eyes fixed on the vent pipe. He had taken over the vent clearing duty at 6 in the morning without being asked. Every 20 minutes, he pushed the rod upward, felt for resistance, struck it if necessary, and settled back. He had not said the words. He had not told Nettie she was right, and he was wrong. He did not need to. His presence in the shelter, alive and warming, said everything that his pride would not allow his mouth to form. At noon, Nettie heard a new sound through the shell, not wind. The wind had been constant for so long that her ears had stopped registering it as information. This was something else, a rhythmic, metallic impact transmitted through the iron shell and into the snow, and through the snow into the tank's interior. Metal striking metal. She pressed her ear against the wall. The sound came again. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 more. Someone was outside, hitting the marker pole with a piece of iron. The sound belonged to Calvin DeWitt. He had left South Pass City at first light, with 2 men and a mule team following the freight markers east along the road. The storm had not broken. The wind still carried snow horizontally across the open ground. But the worst of the overnight fury had dropped enough that a man could see 20 feet ahead if he kept his face turned from the wind. DeWitt found the marker pole because he was looking for the broken wagon. He expected to find a body beside it, or beneath it, or somewhere between the wagon and the road where Nettie had tried to walk and failed. What he found instead was a smooth, featureless drift against the granite, cut with a single iron rod and a pole standing above the surface, and nothing else. He struck the pole with the head of a hatchet because the ice coating made it look like a pipe, and pipes meant mining infrastructure. And mining infrastructure meant a reference point in a landscape that had been wiped clean of every other landmark. 3 strikes. A pause, 3 more. Inside the tank, Nettie answered by driving the vent rod upward as hard as she could. It broke through the ice and emerged into the wind. DeWitt saw the rod appear, saw the snow around it collapse slightly as warm air vented upward, and watched a plume of fog form above the hole and vanish instantly into the gale. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he began to dig. It took DeWitt and his 2 men 40 minutes to uncover the entrance. The drift had added nearly 3 feet of new snow over the canvas since Nettie had last cleared the intake. The men dug with shovels and with their hands, working carefully after DeWitt told them that people were inside and that the structure was snow over iron and could not be torn open carelessly. When the canvas was pulled aside, warm, wet air rolled out of the tank and into the cold and condensed immediately into fog. The fog hung in the entrance trench like smoke, thick enough that DeWitt could not see the interior until he crouched and let the layer pass above him. Nettie sat on the platform with her back against the curved wall. Kello lay beside her with his eyes closed, breathing in shallow, rattling pulls. Orrin Bale sat on the far side of the platform with the vent rod across his knees, ready for the next clearing cycle. The lamp was extinguished. It had been dark inside the tank for more than 2 hours. The air temperature at platform level, measured later by a mercury thermometer that DeWitt carried in his kit, read 26 degrees. Outside, the air read -14 and falling. The wind had slowed to 20 miles per hour. The worst was past, but the cold was deepening in the way that Wyoming cold deepens after a storm, the cloud cover breaking, the radiant heat escaping upward into a clear sky, the temperature dropping through floors that the wind alone could not reach. 26 degrees inside, -14 outside. A 40-degree difference maintained through 27 hours of the worst storm in the region's living memory by 2 people and an intermittent lamp inside a buried iron cylinder insulated by snow. DeWitt touched the exposed front rim of the tank, the section nearest the entrance, where only inches of snow covered the shell. He pulled his hand back immediately. The iron was brutal, cold enough to bond skin to metal. Then he reached past the canvas and touched the buried shell farther inside, where 3 feet of snow separated the iron from the air. His hand stayed. The iron was cool. It was not painful. It was not draining his heat at a rate his body could not sustain. He held his palm there for a long time. "I called it a coffin," he said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man revising a belief he had held for 23 winters. It was the only room on the pass that kept breathing. They brought Kello out on a canvas litter rigged between the mule team. He could not walk. The cracked ribs had worsened. The blood he had coughed onto the snow during the uncontrolled roll suggested a deeper injury than the original binding had addressed. And the prolonged cold, even at the shelter's interior temperature, had weakened him past the point where his body could manage both the fractures and the fever simultaneously. Nettie walked. Her left wrist hung in a sling made from the tether line. 2 fingers on her left hand had turned dark at the tips, and the joint itself had swollen to twice its normal size. She had not eaten in 19 hours. Her lips were cracked, and her cheeks carried the raw, reddened look of skin that had been scoured by cold and wind, and then warmed too quickly. She did not look like a person who had won anything. She looked like a person who had survived a transaction with something larger than herself, and the cost had been written on her body in a language she would carry for years. Bracken walked beside the mule team, favoring his right rear leg where the hoof had struck the tank during the uncontrolled roll. The injury was minor, a bruise, not a fracture, but the horse moved with the careful, deliberate gait of an animal that had spent the night standing in a trench while the world tried to kill everything above the surface. Orrin Bale walked on the other side of the litter. His bare hand, now wrapped in 2 layers of wool and tucked inside his coat, had regained color but not full feeling. Frostbite had claimed the tips of 2 fingers and the edge of 1 ear, injuries that would darken and peel and eventually scar, but would not require amputation. He caught Nettie's eye once during the walk. He did not speak. He nodded, a single short movement that contained within it the acknowledgement he had not been able to voice inside the tank. He had told her the timetable was impossible. He had told her 1 horse and 1 woman could not move 1,000 pounds of iron before the road closed. He had left her a pulley because he respected her effort while expecting her failure. The pulley had held, the rope had held, the tank had moved, and the shelter had held 3 lives through a night that would have killed all 3 of them on the open road. The nod was enough. The validation arrived in layers, the way Nettie had built the snow around the shell. Not all at once, but in stages, each one compressing the space in which doubt could survive. The doctor in South Pass City examined Kello and confirmed what Nettie already knew. The ribs were cracked in 2 places, and the lung beneath the lower fracture had been bruised by the fall during the uncontrolled roll. The prolonged cold had slowed his recovery, but the shelter's interior temperature had prevented the kind of deep hypothermia that would have stopped his heart before morning. The doctor's verdict was clinical, not dramatic. Prolonged exposure at the outside temperature would probably have killed Kello by midnight. The shelter had not healed him. It had kept the cold from finishing what the injury had started. This was the first validation, private, medical, offered in a boarding house room where Kello lay wrapped in quilts, and Nettie sat with her wrist in a proper splint. It confirmed the shelter's most basic claim. The iron tank buried in snow, with 2 openings and 1 guarded flame, had maintained a survivable environment through conditions that destroyed every conventional shelter on the road that night. The second validation came from Orrin, and it came publicly. 3 days after the storm, in Ada Prowse's boarding house, the same room where meals were served and accounts settled and stories told with the weight of experience rather than the lightness of gossip, Orrin described the failure of his wagon shelter to a room of teamsters and freight men who had gathered because the storm had trapped everyone in town, and there was nothing to do except eat Ada's biscuits and talk about what the wind had done. I had a good box, he said. Sound canvas, 2 blankets, a stoveplate I could not light because the wind blew the match sideways before it reached the kindling. The snow came through the seams before the first hour was done. By the second hour, the canvas was catching drift the way a sail catches wind. The box filled. I dug out twice. The third time, the canvas tore and the box was finished. He paused. She had a rusted tank and a pint of kerosene. When I crawled through her entrance at 3 a.m, the air inside was warm enough that the ice on my face melted before I reached the platform. He did not use the word warm. He said the air was survivable. He said the wind did not exist inside the shell. He said the iron wall, the one he had tested with his bare hand, felt like a stoneware jar that had been sitting near a stove, not hot, not even properly warm, but holding its temperature with a patience that canvas and timber could not match. The teamsters listened. These were men who had spent their careers managing heat loss, building fires, sealing seams, calculating how much wood a night required, choosing campsites based on wind exposure and fuel availability. They understood the arithmetic of winter survival at a level that most people never needed to reach. And the arithmetic Orrin was describing did not match anything they had seen. A buried iron tank, 3 feet of dry snow, a lamp burning 9 hours out of 27, 3 people alive. The numbers did not make sense to men who thought of metal as an enemy in cold weather. But the numbers were attached to a man they knew, sitting in a room they trusted, describing an experience he had survived 3 days ago. The third validation came from DeWitt, and it came hard. Calvin DeWitt was not a man who admitted error easily. 23 winters had given him a set of convictions about cold weather survival that functioned as physical laws: immutable, tested, reliable. Iron conducts heat. Wind kills faster than cold. Canvas and timber and fire are the only materials that stand between a body and the winter. These were not opinions. They were the rules he had survived by, and revising them meant admitting that his survival had been narrower than his competence suggested. He came to the boarding house a week after the storm. He asked Nettie to walk him through the shelter's design, not the concept. He understood the concept, but the specific construction. How deep was the cradle? How thick was the snow cover? How the vent worked? How the canvas entrance slowed the air without sealing it? How the platform separated the sleepers from the coldest surface? Nettie answered every question with specifics, measurements, materials, sequences. She did not soften the answers to make them easier to accept. She did not present them as guesses or improvisations. She had measured, calculated, and built according to a design that combined her father's understanding of air movement, Kello's knowledge of heat distribution, and her own capacity to translate principles into physical construction under pressure. DeWitt listened for an hour. Then he asked to see the shelter. They rode out together on a clear day. The storm had passed. The road was packed hard by wind, and the freight markers stood above the surface again. The drift against the granite cut had settled and reshaped, but the tank remained buried, its marker pole still visible, its vent rod still protruding from the snow cap. DeWitt entered the shelter. The interior was cold now, unoccupied, unheated, the air inside matching the air outside within a few degrees. But the evidence was there. Soot marks above the lamp bracket, the raised platform with its feed sack supports, the double canvas entrance with its crooked vestibule, the vent pipe threading upward through the crown. He pressed his palm against the buried wall. I drove freight through the worst this country has to offer, he said. Blizzards that killed horses standing, cold that froze axle grease solid. I have seen a man die between his wagon and his team because 30 feet was too far in what the wind was doing. He pulled his hand back and looked at it as though the temperature had left something visible on his skin. "I would not have built this," he said. "I would not have thought to build this. I would have turned the wagon over and died under it like every man I was ever taught to imitate." He looked at Nettie. "You are right. I was wrong, and I am glad I was wrong, because if I had been right, you and Kello and Orrin would be under 4 feet of snow right now, and no one would know why." This was not a gracious concession. It was not a philosophical moment about the nature of knowledge. It was a man built from experience confronting the limit of that experience and choosing accuracy over pride. He did not enjoy it. He would not repeat it publicly with the same candor, but he said it, and Nettie heard it, and that was enough. Kello healed slowly in Ada Prouse's boarding house. The ribs knit over weeks, the lung bruise resolved, the fever broke and returned and broke again before his body finally gained enough ground to hold the temperature steady. During the recovery, he and Nettie began the work that would outlast both of them. They drew the shelter from memory on brown paper that Ada provided from the store wrapping supply. Not a sketch, a plan. Shell orientation, minimum snow cover, 3 feet on every surface, double curtain entrance with offset inner flap, raised platform 12 inches minimum above the shell floor, separated vents, low intake beneath the canvas, high exhaust through the crown, marker pole visible above the expected maximum drift. Exterior tether line connecting the entrance to the nearest road marker. Lamp pan suspended from the shell, sand filled away from canvas. Condensation channel. The shell tilted 2 degrees toward the entrance so moisture ran away from the bedding. Kello insisted on one addition. At the top of the plan, above the diagram and the measurements and the material list, he told Nettie to write a single rule in letters large enough to read by lamplight. 2 openings before 1 flame. "The lamp is the most dangerous thing in this shelter," he said. "It keeps a body alive and it kills a body dead, and the only difference is whether the air can move. A person afraid of the cold will seal the entrance and trust the flame. They will wake with a headache and think they are tired. They will not wake again. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless. A steady flame does not prove the air is safe. The only proof is airflow. 2 openings, 1 low and 1 high, maintained at all costs, even when the cold they admit seems like the enemy. The cold was never the enemy. The stillness was." Nettie copied the plan 6 times. She gave 1 to Orrin, 1 to DeWitt, 1 to Ada Prouse, 1 she nailed inside the original shelter. 2 she kept for future use. She did not charge for the copies. Knowledge does not cost less because someone paid for it in blood, Kello said when she asked whether to set a price. It costs more. The price was already paid. Charging again is interest on a debt that should not exist. The spring and summer of 1899 passed in the slow, laborious rhythm of construction at altitude. Nettie and Kello found a second abandoned storage tank near a steep road cut 2 miles east of the original shelter. This one was slightly longer, 11 feet, and in better condition. The lower seam was sound. Both end plates were intact. The reinforcing rings carried clear, even tones when struck. They converted it into the first permanent refuge. The improvements reflected everything the original crisis had taught them. Stone and earth packed around the lower half before winter, so the shelter did not depend entirely on snowfall for its insulation. A snow-catching fence, 3 posts, and 2 cross rails of salvaged mining timber. placed uphill of the drift to accelerate accumulation around the shell. Two separate ventilation pipes, each 2 inches in diameter, threaded through the crown and fitted with downward-facing caps to reduce snow entry. A small double-curtain vestibule at the entrance, built from timber framing and canvas rather than improvised from feed sacks. Floorboards raised 14 inches on stone and timber supports. An interior mallet and 2 vent clearing rods hung from wire loops inside the shell. 6 days' worth of hard biscuits, candles, matches, and lamp fuel sealed in numbered tins and stored on a shelf bolted to the reinforcing ring. A 12-foot marker pole painted in alternating dark and light bands, visible against both snow and bare ground. A rope line connecting the entrance to the nearest road marker. They did not guarantee a specific insulating value. Kello refused to state an exact number because the performance depended on snow density, moisture content, wind exposure, and a dozen other variables that changed with every storm. Instead, the standard was physical. 3 feet of settled dry snow or packed earth around the occupied shell, minimum. If the cover was thinner, the shelter was not ready. The teaching began that autumn. Nettie taught teamsters in sessions that lasted an afternoon and covered the 5 essential skills. How to probe a drift before digging, using a sharpened rod to test depth, density, and the presence of ice layers that would conduct heat rather than slow it. How to leave temporary snow ribs during excavation, the lesson that had saved her when the crust collapsed during the original construction. How to listen for loose rivets, Kello's method of reading a shell through sound rather than sight, identifying corroded plates and compromised seams before they became structural failures. How to build a low intake and a high exhaust, the ventilation geometry that kept the air moving without creating a wind tunnel. How to ration flame rather than seal the shelter, the most dangerous lesson because it contradicted every instinct a cold person possessed. She taught by demonstration. She stood inside the second shelter with 3 teamsters and a lit lamp and showed them the flame behavior when she blocked the intake. The fire lengthened. The color shifted. The air thickened. She held the block for 10 seconds, long enough for the men to feel the change in their chests, and then released it. That was 10 seconds, she said. In an hour, you would not feel the change. You would feel tired. You would feel confused. You would lie down. The lamp would burn until the oxygen was gone, and then it would go out, and then you would go out, and in the morning someone would find you looking like you fell asleep. No one argued. Kello attended the first 3 sessions. He stood behind Nettie and watched her correct a teamster's vent layout. The man had placed both openings at the same height, which created lateral air movement but no vertical draw, and did not intervene. He waited until she had finished explaining the correction, and the teamster had repositioned the upper pipe, and then he turned to Nettie and said nothing. But the look on his face was the look of a man watching a tool he had sharpened cut cleanly through the wood. He was shifting, not retreating, not weakening, but deliberately stepping from instructor to observer. He had taught Nettie what he knew. He was now watching to see whether she could teach others what she had learned. Not just his knowledge, but the knowledge she had built on top of his, in the storm, in the dark, with one working hand and a vent rod that needed clearing every 15 minutes. She could. If this story reminds you why knowledge should be shared before the emergency arrives, send it to someone who believes preparation begins after the warning. Merritt Copley filed his complaint against Nettie in the 2nd week of March. Theft of mine property, unauthorized occupation of leased land, damage to equipment listed on the snowcap manifest. The complaint was written in the careful, specific language of a man who understood that legal documents needed to sound reasonable, even when their purpose was not. The local justice, a man named Avery Teague, who served the South Pass District, with the weary pragmatism of someone who had adjudicated too many mining disputes to be impressed by any of them, reviewed the complaint and declined immediate seizure. His reasoning was practical rather than philosophical. Nettie's unpaid wage claim against Copley's mine was documented in her own ledger and corroborated by Ada Prowse, who had seen the work and could testify to the hours. The tank itself had been listed as abandoned equipment on the Snowcap Manifest for 3 years, during which time Copley had made no effort to retrieve, sell, or maintain it. The question of whether an abandoned item on an expired work site constituted active property was not one that Teague intended to answer in a hurry, particularly when the alternative was seizing a widow's horse and wagon on behalf of a freight contractor whose reputation for creative accounting was known to everyone in the district. Copley demanded payment for the tank's scrap value. Nettie presented an itemized invoice, $31.40 in unpaid wages, $4 in medical supplies purchased for Kello from Ada Prowse's stock, estimated transport cost for an injured man 6 miles through a blizzard, which, she noted, Copley had refused to provide when his own sleigh was present and operational. The total exceeded the tank's value. Copley looked at the invoice and looked at Teague and understood that the arithmetic had turned against him. He could press the complaint and risk a countersuit that would expose his wage practices to formal scrutiny, or he could withdraw and preserve the fiction that his ledger was accurate. He withdrew, but he did not forget. The autumn of 1900 arrived with the kind of cold that announced itself weeks early, frost in September, ice on standing water by mid-October, a stillness in the air that experienced men recognized as the atmosphere holding its breath before something enormous. Kello's lungs had deteriorated through the spring and summer in a way that no rest or warm room could reverse. Years of mine dust, the fine silicate particles that hung in poorly ventilated shafts and settled in the lungs like sediment in a stream, and years of boiler smoke and years of breathing air that carried more mineral than oxygen had accumulated into a permanent shortness of breath that worsened with every cold morning. He knew he would not survive another winter in the high country. The altitude alone, 7,000 feet above the sea, thinned the air past what his damaged lungs could manage when the cold contracted the tissue further. His final working scene was not a farewell. It was not a speech. He and Nettie inspected the second shelter in October, checking the vent pipes, the canvas, the stored supplies, the marker pole. He tapped the shell with the hammer, his hammer, the one he had carried since his years in Cornwall, and listened to the rings. Nettie tapped the shell beside him. She found a dull tone on the third course near the lower seam and rejected the plate without asking him. "You heard it," he said. "I heard it." He handed her the hammer, not symbolically, not with ceremony. He held it out and she took it and put it in her tool roll because that was where it belonged now. He left South Pass City in November, riding south with a freight convoy toward the lower country where the air was thicker and warmer and a man with half his lung capacity could breathe without fighting for every mouthful. He died several weeks later in Ada Prowse's sister's boarding house in Rawlins. The cause was pneumonia, which is what mine dust becomes when the lungs can no longer clear what the air delivers. Ada received the letter and told Nettie on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen where the stove heat was strong enough that neither of them needed to wear a coat. Nettie did not cry in front of Ada. She went to the supply room where the shelter plans were stored and took down Kello's hammer from the nail where she had hung it after the October inspection. Frost had formed inside the hammer's eye, a thin shell of ice in the socket where the handle met the head, crystallized from the moisture in the cold room's air. She held the hammer over the stove until the frost melted and the iron warmed to the temperature of a living hand. Then she dried it with a cloth. placed it in her tool roll, and went back to work. The grief lived in the hammer's weight. Not in words, not in tears, not in the days that followed, but in the specific heft of a boilermaker's tool that had been calibrated to a dead man's hand and now belonged to a woman who had learned to read iron by its sound. In January of 1901, the lesson was tested without the teacher. A freight sleigh carrying Merritt Copley's 19-year-old son Dillard and 4 mine workers lost the road during a ground blizzard 3 miles east of the second shelter. The driver Sionde, a man named Farquhar, hired that season, had never driven the South Pass Road in a winter. He followed the freight markers until the blowing snow erased them, then guessed at the route, then stopped guessing when the sleigh's left runner dropped into a drainage cut that the snow had hidden. The sleigh tipped. The mules panicked and tangled in the traces. Farquhar freed the team, but lost the road in the process. The 5 men huddled against the overturned sleigh, while the wind reduced their world to a circle 6 feet in diameter. Dillard Copley was 19 and had spent his life in freight offices and supply rooms. He had never slept outside in a storm. He had never experienced cold that attacked the body as a physical force rather than a seasonal inconvenience. Within an hour, he stopped shivering, not because he was warming, but because his body had exhausted the energy required to shiver and had begun the slow, quiet surrender that hypothermia imposes on the unwilling. The marker pole that would have pointed directly toward the nearest refuge, the second shelter, less than half a mile from where the sleigh had tipped, was gone. Merritt Copley had removed it 6 months earlier, arguing that travelers would trespass on his leased road and consume supplies that belonged to the mine. Nettie learned of the overturned sleigh from a rider who had passed the last freight marker before the road disappeared and seen the mules wandering without their sleigh. She went to DeWitt. DeWitt went to Orrin. The 3 of them left South Pass City within the hour, following the measured rope lines that Nettie had installed between the road markers and the shelter entrances. The rope lines held. They had been set in October and maintained through the autumn storms. Each line was anchored to a post at the road and ran in a straight course to the shelter entrance, marked every 20 feet with a knot that a gloved hand could feel. They found the overturned sleigh. 2 of the mine workers were conscious and moving. 2 were sitting against the sleigh box with their arms wrapped around their knees, responsive but slow. Dillard Copley lay between them with his eyes open and his body still. He was alive. His pulse was slow, and his skin was the color of candle wax, but he was alive. Nettie did not carry him to the shelter. She sent DeWitt and Orrin ahead with the 2 strongest workers to clear the entrance and light the lamp. Then she led Farquhar and the remaining worker along the rope line with Dillard carried between them on the sleigh's detached cargo platform. At the shelter, she cleared both vents before allowing anyone inside. She checked the canvas entrance, found the inner flap frozen to the outer curtain, and separated them with a knife. She lit the lamp, confirmed the flame color, confirmed the airflow, and only then allowed the 5 men to enter. The vent pipe on the east side had developed a crack at the collar. Frost heaving had shifted the stone packing around the pipe's base and opened a gap that let snow enter the exhaust. Warm air escaping through the crack would melt the snow, which would refreeze and gradually seal the pipe. Nettie repaired it in the dark, in the wind, kneeling on the roof of the drift with her right hand holding Kello's hammer and her left arm braced against the marker pole for balance. She drove the cracked collar tight against a strip of iron cut from the sleigh's brake assembly, packed the gap with a mixture of tallow and fine gravel, and restored the pipe's function. She had never repaired a vent collar in a storm. Kello had never demonstrated the technique because the problem had not existed during his lifetime. She solved it with his tools, his principles, and her own capacity to adapt a known method to an unknown situation. Dillard Copley regained consciousness inside the shelter 2 hours later. He did not understand where he was. The curved iron walls, the soot-marked lamp bracket, the raised platform, the canvas vestibule. None of it matched any structure he had ever seen. "Where is this?" he asked. "The place your father tried to tear down," Orrin said. No one elaborated. The silence that followed said enough. The aftermath of the second rescue divided the community along a line that Copley had spent 2 years trying to prevent. The 5 men who survived the overturned sleigh told the story to everyone who would listen. Farquhar, the driver, described the shelter with the precise language of a man who understood that his life had been saved by something he could describe but not yet fully comprehend. The mine workers described the contrast between the overturned sleigh, wind, snow, dropping temperature, the slow surrender of the body sun, and the buried tank, stillness, warmth, the lamp's clean flame, the sound of breathing instead of the sound of dying. Dillard Copley told his father. The conversation between Merritt Copley and his son was not witnessed and cannot be dramatized with confidence. What can be documented is the result. 2 weeks after the rescue, Copley visited Nettie at Ada Prowse's boarding house. He did not send a message ahead. He did not bring his freight hands or his ledger. He came alone in the early afternoon and sat at the table where Nettie kept her shelter plans and inspection records. He did not apologize. The word never left his mouth, and Nettie did not expect it to. Copley was not a man who revised his behavior through confession. He revised it through action, and only when the evidence left no alternative that his pride could occupy. He placed the removed marker pole on the table. The paint had faded where it had lain in his equipment shed for 6 months, but the alternating dark and light bands were still visible. Then he placed his freight road map beside it. The map showed every mile of road his lease covered, every junction, every exposed shoulder where the wind funneled between granite cuts, every stretch where a loaded sleigh or a tired horse could lose the road in blowing snow. "Put one wherever the wind has room to run," he said. "Leave my name off them." Nettie studied the map. She did not thank him. She did not acknowledge the reversal. She treated the map the way she treated every piece of information that affected shelter placement, as data, not emotion. "I will need access across the lease road to inspect and resupply," she said. "You have it." "I will need transport for 2 damaged freight tanks that are sitting in the snow-capped tailings, iron pipe, fittings, and labor to move the heavy pieces." Copley's jaw tightened. Donating access was one thing. Donating equipment and labor was currency, and currency was the language his pride spoke. "The tanks are scrap," he said. "They have been scrap for 3 years. I am disposing of them." "You are donating them." "I am disposing of them to a person who has a use for refuse. There is no donation." He signed access agreements. He arranged transport. He left without shaking Nettie's hand or meeting her eyes for more than a moment. His conversion was not warm. It was not philosophical. It was not the redemption of a man who had seen the error of his ways and embraced a better nature. It was the capitulation of a man whose own actions had nearly killed his own son, and who understood, with the cold, calculating precision that made him effective in business, that opposing the shelter system was now more expensive than supporting it. Nettie accepted the terms. She did not need Copley's friendship. She needed his road, his tanks, and his labor. The work continued. By the winter of 1902, the system had grown past what one person could inspect alone. 3 buried refugees covered the most exposed sections of the freight road between South Pass City and the Eastern Junction, the original shelter near the granite cut, the permanent second shelter 2 miles east, and a new installation at the shoulder where the road crossed an open saddle with no windbreak for 3/4 of a mile in any direction. The third shelter was the first one Nettie built without Kello. She selected the tank from Copley's donated scrap, an 11-foot cylinder with a slightly heavier gauge than the first two. Its shells sound across every course when she tapped it with the hammer. The reinforcing rings carried clear, even tones. The lower seam showed surface corrosion, but no thinning. Both end plates were intact and seated properly in their flanges. She chose the site based on 3 years of observation. The saddle crossing was the single most dangerous stretch of road in the district. Opened wind from every direction, no natural drift accumulation, no granite cuts or timber to anchor a snow-catching structure. Teamsters had been losing the road at that crossing since the first freight wagons reached the district, and every winter produced at least one story of a driver who wandered off the track in blowing snow and was found a 1/4 mile away, alive or otherwise, after the storm passed. The problem was that the saddle had no natural drift. Snow did not accumulate there because the wind swept the surface clean. The shelters Nettie had built relied on snow for insulation, 3 feet minimum around the occupied shell. Without a drift to bury the tank in, the system failed before it began. She solved it the way Kello would have solved it, not by fighting the environment, but by changing the environment's behavior. She built a snow fence, 3 posts of salvaged mining timber driven into the frozen ground at the high side of the saddle, 2 cross rails connecting them, and a series of vertical slats spaced 6 inches apart. The fence did not block the wind, it disrupted it. Wind-carrying snow particles hit the slats, lost speed, dropped the snow on the lee side, accelerated again, and moved on. The deposited snow accumulated in a drift that grew deeper with every storm. By December, the fence had built a drift 8 feet deep on its lee side. The tank sat in the heart of it, buried under 4 feet of settled snow, with its marker pole and vent rod standing above the surface, and its rope line running straight to the nearest road marker. The third shelter was inspected by Orrin before the first heavy storm. He crawled inside, lit the lamp, checked the flame, confirmed the airflow, and noted the platform height, the canvas condition, the supply tins, and the vent rod function in a record book that Nettie had begun keeping for every shelter in the system. "The entrance face is wrong," he said when he emerged. Nettie looked at the entrance. It faced south-southwest, away from the prevailing wind. "Prevailing wind is from the northwest," she said. "The entrance faces away from it." "January wind is not November wind," Orrin said. "The worst storms on this saddle come from the southwest. I've driven this road in January, blizzards that came from behind me when every flag and fence told me the wind should be in my face. If a southwest gale drives snow into that entrance, your vestibule becomes a funnel." Nettie studied the entrance for a long time. "You're right," she said. She rebuilt the vestibule with a 90-degree turn. The entrance still faced south-southwest, but a canvas baffle inside the vestibule forced the air to turn a corner before reaching the interior. A southwest wind entering the tunnel would hit the baffle, lose speed and direction, and arrive at the living space as a slow seep rather than a blast. The modification cost her 2 days of work and required moving the marker pole to accommodate the new entrance geometry. She did not argue with Orrin's assessment. She did not defend her original design. She tested the revision with a candle flame at the platform and confirmed that the interior air remained still when the wind blew from every quarter. This was the nature of the partnership that had formed between them. Not romance, not affection, but the steady practical trust of 2 people who respected each other's competence enough to accept correction without interpreting it as attack. Orrin saw wind patterns. Nettie saw shell integrity and ventilation geometry. Their disagreements were productive because both of them cared more about the shelters working than about being right. They argued about entrance size for a year. Orrin favored larger entrances. His reasoning was operational. In a rescue situation, a larger opening allowed faster extraction of an unconscious person. Nettie favored narrow entrances. Her reasoning was thermal. A larger opening increased air exchange, which increased heat loss, which reduced the margin between survivable and lethal. They tested both designs in the second shelter during a moderate storm in February 1903. Orrin widened the entrance by 8 inches, and they measured the interior temperature drop over 6 hours. Nettie narrowed it back to the original dimension, and they measured the recovery time. Then they split the difference. A narrow inner opening with a wider outer vestibule that funneled toward the narrow gap. The compromise was not elegant. The vestibule looked like something assembled by 2 people who could not agree on the width of a doorway, but the air test showed stable interior temperatures with faster rescue access, and the candle flame at the platform held steady in wind from every direction. Nettie recorded the modified dimensions in the inspection ledger. Orrin signed the entry. Neither of them mentioned that the argument had lasted 14 months. The system grew because the road demanded it. By the winter of 1904, 5 shelters covered the freight route. The 4th and 5th were not built by Nettie alone. Teamsters who had attended her training sessions, men who had learned to probe drifts, listen for loose rivets, build ventilation geometry, and ration flame, contributed labor and transport. Copley's donated tanks and pipe fittings provided the heavy materials. The community provided the rest: canvas, rope, lamp fuel, hard biscuits, matches, and the hours of inspection that kept the system functional between storms. The inspection responsibility divided itself along practical lines. DeWitt checked the 2 easternmost shelters because his mail route passed them weekly. Orrin checked the Saddle Crossing shelter because his freight runs crossed it most frequently. Nettie inspected all 5 at least once a month and after every major storm. Ada Prowse managed the supply inventory from her boarding house, keeping a ledger of what each shelter contained, what needed replacement, and what had been consumed by travelers who used the refugees between inspections. The supplies disappeared regularly. This was expected and accepted. A teamster caught in a sudden squall would follow the rope line to the nearest shelter, enter, light the lamp, eat the biscuits, burn the fuel, and leave when the weather cleared. Most of them left payment in the tin, not because anyone required it, but because the culture of the road had shifted. The shelters were not charity. They were infrastructure. Using them and replenishing them was the same transaction. Some travelers left notes. Nettie found them tucked into the supply tins or scratched onto the iron walls with the tip of a nail. Brief messages, a name, a date, a line about the weather or the condition of the vent. One man wrote, "Vent cleared 4 times in 6 hours. Wind from the west. Lamp burned clean. Thank you." Another wrote only his name and the date and the single word "alive." The notes accumulated. Nettie kept them in a box in the supply room. She did not display them or read them aloud or treat them as evidence of her accomplishment. They were data. They told her which shelters were being used, which vents were problematic, which supply tins needed restocking, and which storms were generating the kind of conditions that drove men underground. The instructions she painted on the interior walls of every shelter became the system's most important feature, more important than the iron, more important than the snow, more important than the lamp. Because the iron and the snow and the lamp would only protect a person who used them correctly, and the instructions ensured that a person who had never seen the shelter before could operate it without training. The painted words read, "Keep the lower opening clear. Clear the upper vent every 20 minutes during heavy snow. Raise your bedding off the floor. Light the lamp only after both openings are confirmed. Mark the entrance before you enter. Never trust a flame more than fresh air. 6 rules, 43 words. The distillation of everything Nettie had learned from her father, from Kello, from the night in the original shelter when the vent ice shut and the headache arrived and the carbon monoxide announced itself through symptoms that only a trained person would recognize as death approaching. Drivers began carrying vent rods and dark marker cloth as standard winter equipment, packed alongside their usual provisions of blankets, candles, and extra harness leather. The vent rod was Kello's contribution to frontier survival, delivered through Nettie to a community that would never meet the Cornish boilermaker who understood that warm air rises, wet air freezes, and a sealed space kills faster than an open storm. Yea, the years compressed the way years do when the work is steady and the crises become manageable rather than existential. By 1905, 6 shelters. By 1906, 7. 22 miles of mining and freight road covered, with rope lines connecting every shelter entrance to the nearest road marker, and every marker pole painted in alternating bands that could be seen against snow, bare ground, and the particular gray-brown of the South Pass landscape in autumn. Nettie's boarding house, she had taken over the operation from Ada Prouse, who retired to her sister's home in Rawlins in 1904, served as both a winter supply depot and an informal training center. Teamsters passing through would ask questions about shelter maintenance, vent problems, canvas replacement, and the particular challenge of keeping the supply tins dry in shelters that experienced condensation during temperature swings. She answered every question with the same precision she had used when DeWitt asked her to walk him through the design. Measurements, materials, sequences. She did not simplify for convenience or soften for politeness. The information was the information, and delivering it inaccurately could cost a life. Orrin managed the transport logistics, which shelters needed resupply, which roads were accessible, which tanks had developed corrosion that required inspection before the next winter. His freight connections gave him access to abandoned equipment across the district, and he developed a network of sources for the iron pipe, canvas, and hardware that the system consumed. Their partnership did not become a romance. The outline of their relationship was professional. 2 people whose skills complemented each other, whose disagreements improved the system, whose mutual respect had been earned through shared crisis and sustained collaboration. They ate meals together at the boarding house. They argued about entrance geometry and vent cap design over coffee that Ada had taught Nettie to make strong enough to dissolve a nail. They traveled the inspection routes together when the weather permitted, and separately when it did not. If either of them felt something beyond professional respect, it did not enter the record. What entered the record were the inspection dates, the vent conditions, the supply levels, and the names of the people who walked out of the shelters alive. One afternoon in the autumn of 1907, Nettie received a letter from a freight company in Lander requesting the shelter plans. The company operated a route over a different section of the Wind River Range, higher and more exposed than the South Pass Road. They had lost 2 drivers the previous winter, one dead, one permanently disabled, and they had heard about the buried tank system from a teamster who had used the saddle crossing shelter during a January storm. Nettie copied the plans and added notes specific to the Lander route. Higher altitude meant lower snow density, which meant less insulating value per foot of cover. She recommended 4 feet minimum instead of 3, and she added a note about the relationship between altitude and oxygen. At higher elevations, the air carried less oxygen per breath, which meant the carbon monoxide danger was greater, and the vent maintenance schedule was tighter. She sent the plans without charge. 2 more requests arrived that winter, one from a mining operation near Atlantic City, One from a rancher whose property included a stretch of road between his house and the nearest town, 9 miles of exposed ridge where the wind ran unbroken from the Sweetwater Valley to the Continental Divide. Each request received a customized response. Nettie did not send a generic plan. She asked about the site, elevation, prevailing wind, available drift accumulation, nearest road markers, distance to the next shelter or settlement. Then she modified the standard design to fit the conditions and sent the modified plan with the same 6 rules painted at the top. The system was spreading beyond her direct control. This was what she wanted. It was also what she feared. A man who builds a shelter from a plan he does not understand will trust the plan instead of the air, she told Orrin during an inspection of the 4th shelter. The plan says, light the lamp. The plan does not say, watch the flame. The plan says, clear the vent. The plan does not say what happens when you forget. You cannot teach every person who copies a plan, Orrin said. No, but I can make the plan impossible to follow without reading the rules first. She redesigned the instruction layout. On the new plans, the 6 rules were not at the bottom of the page, beneath the diagram, where a builder would skip them in favor of the measurements. They were at the top, above the diagram, in letters twice the size of the construction specifications. And the first rule, keep the lower opening clear, was written as the title of the document, so that anyone who glanced at the plan would absorb the most critical instruction before reading anything else. It was a small change. It was also the kind of change that separated a system that worked when the designer was present from a system that worked when the designer was 200 miles away and would never meet the person whose life depended on the accuracy of a vent-clearing schedule. The original shelter failed its inspection in the autumn of 1908. Nettie crawled inside on a clear October afternoon and tapped the shell with Kello's hammer. The first course rang true. The second course rang true. The third course near the lower seam, the same section where Kello had first identified heavy corrosion on the afternoon of February 9th, 1899. Returned a sound she had never heard from iron before. Not a dull thud, which meant thinned plate. Not a clear ring, which meant sound metal. A soft, fibrous hiss, like tapping on compressed wool. The iron had corroded through. What remained was not metal, but a lattice of rust and mineral deposit that held its shape only because nothing had pressed against it yet. She probed the seam with a pick. The point went through the plate with no more resistance than it would have met passing through heavy paper. She sat inside the shelter for a long time. The soot marks above the lamp bracket were still there, darker than she remembered, layered by 9 years of intermittent use. The platform supports showed the bolt holes where she had raised the sleeping surface away from the cold floor. The vent pipe remained in the crown, threaded through the hole where the pipe fitting had torn free during the uncontrolled roll on that first afternoon. Scratched names and dates covered the interior walls around the painted instructions. A palimpsest of survival that recorded every person who had entered the shelter, lit the lamp, cleared the vent, and walked out alive. She could repair the corroded section, patch it with a plate cut from another tank, riveted in place, sealed with tar and canvas. The repair would hold for a few more years, perhaps longer, depending on moisture and ground contact and the slow, patient chemistry of iron returning to ore. But the repair would be a lie. The lower seam was compromised along its entire length. Patching one section would not restore the structural integrity that the shell required to bear the weight of 5 feet of settled snow pressing downward through a winter. If the seam failed under load, the collapse would not be gradual. It would be sudden, the shell buckling inward, the snow ceiling dropping onto whoever was inside, the entrance sealing as the drift settled into the new void. She could not allow sentiment to override inspection. She closed the shelter, She bolted a timber barrier across the entrance, removed the supply tins, pulled the marker pole and rope line, and painted a single word on the exposed rim in red lead: condemned. The original tank, the coffin with rivets, the cylinder that DeWitt had dismissed and Copley had claimed and Orrin had doubted and Kello had helped her bury, was retired from service. She built a replacement 200 yards east using a sound tank from Copley's latest scrap donation. The new marker pole stood where the old one had stood. The new rope line followed the same course to the same road marker. A traveler following the rope in a storm would arrive at the same shelter entrance, in the same drift, against the same granite cut. The iron had changed. The principle had not. Nettie Rourke remained in the South Pass district for the rest of her working life. The boarding house became the administrative center of the shelter system, not by design, but by accumulation. The inspection ledgers lived there. The supply records lived there. The copied plans, each one customized for a specific site and a specific set of conditions, lived in a flat wooden drawer beneath the counter where guests paid for their rooms. Kello's hammer hung from a square nail above the desk. Its handle had darkened from decades of use. Nettie's hand, Nettie's grip, Nettie's habit of carrying it on every inspection, even after the physical labor of construction had been taken over by younger men with intact wrists and undamaged joints. She kept the hammer not because it reminded her of Kello. She kept it because it was the best hammer she had ever used. Balanced, weighted for a boilermaker's specific needs, shaped by years of precise strikes against iron and rivet and pipe collar. She reached for it the way a person reaches for any tool that has been tested past the point of trust and into the territory of extension. It was not a memento, it was equipment. Her later ledger recorded shelter inspections beside flour purchases, room payments, horse feed, and storm observations. The entries were terse: dates, conditions, actions taken. She did not write narratives. She did not record feelings. She recorded measurements because measurements could be repeated and verified and built upon, and feelings could not. The later life sequence compressed itself into the rhythm of the seasons: autumn inspections, winter storms, spring repairs, summer construction. Each year added a name to the inspection roster: a new teamster trained, a new freight driver who carried a vent rod alongside his blankets, a new section of road covered by a shelter that Nettie had designed and someone else had built. Several of the original iron shelters were replaced by wood-lined and earth-bermed versions as the corroded tanks reached the end of their structural lives. The wood-lined shelters performed differently. Wood insulated better than iron, but distributed heat less evenly across the interior surface. Nettie modified the ventilation geometry to compensate, adding a second low intake to prevent cold spots near the wooden walls where stagnant air could pool. The modifications were recorded in the plans. The plans were copied. The copies spread. One afternoon in the autumn of 1912, Nettie sat on the boarding house porch and watched two young teamsters she did not recognize probe a drift beside the road with sharpened rods. They worked methodically. One probed. The other watched the rod for the slight vibration that indicated an ice layer beneath the surface, a detail that Nettie had added to the training curriculum in 1905 after discovering that an ice lens within a drift conducted heat 10 times faster than the dry snow around it, creating a thermal bridge that could compromise a shelter's insulation. The first teamster pulled his rod and compared the marks with a notebook. 3 feet 8 inches, he said. Good snow. No ice until 4 feet 2. The second teamster nodded. 2 openings before 1 flame, he said. Not as an instruction, as a confirmation, the way a pilot says a checklist item aloud. Not because he has forgotten, but because saying it makes it real. Nettie watched them from the porch. They did not know she was there. They did not know whose porch they were standing near. They were two men doing work they had been trained to do, following a system they trusted because someone had built it and someone had tested it and someone had written the rules in letters large enough to read by lamplight. She did not correct them. There was nothing to correct. She went inside and recorded the date, the drift depth, and the ice layer measurement in the inspection ledger, alongside the flour delivery and the room payment from the previous night's guest. The hammer hung above the desk. The plans lay in the drawer. The stove ticked as the fire settled. Outside, the two teamsters finished their measurements and moved on toward the road. 7 shelters eventually covered the most exposed portions of the local freight routes between South Pass City and the Eastern Junction. The decisive legacy was not the number of tanks buried in drifts along the road. It was the checklist copied onto every interior wall, painted in red lead in letters sized for lamplight and panic. Keep the intake open, clear the upper vent, raise the bedding, ration the lamp, mark the entrance, never trust a flame more than fresh air. Drivers carried vent rods and dark marker cloth alongside their blankets and provisions, not because someone required it, but because the road had taught them what the shelters could do and what the shelters demanded in return. Nettie Rourke ran the boarding house and maintained the inspection ledger until her hands could no longer hold the pen steady enough to record the measurements. Kello's hammer hung from the same square nail for decades, its handle darkened past the color of any wood, its head carrying the particular sheen of iron that has been used and cleaned and used again until the surface achieves a polish that no forge intended. Her later entries grew shorter, dates and numbers, the minimum data required to confirm that the system was functioning. The last entry in her hand recorded a vent clearing time, a drift depth, and the temperature inside the saddle crossing shelter on a January morning. No commentary, no summary. The number was the record, and the record was enough. Spring melt in a late year exposed the upper reinforcing ring of the original shelter, the condemned tank near the granite cut where everything had begun. Rust ran down the riveted shell in streaks the color of old blood. The canvas was gone. The marker pole had been moved to the replacement shelter 200 yards east. A timber barrier still blocked the entrance where Nettie had bolted it years before, its surface weathered to the gray of driftwood. Iron in a Wyoming storm is a coffin with rivets. Calvin DeWitt said that on the afternoon of February 9th, 1899, standing beside a broken wagon on a frozen road, while the eastern sky disappeared behind a wall of blowing snow. He said it with the authority of 23 winters and the certainty of a man whose experience had never been wrong. Inside the abandoned shell, the evidence answered him without words. Smoke stains darkened the iron above the old lamp bracket, layered by years of guarded flame. 12 inches above the curved floor, 4 bolt holes marked where Nettie had raised the sleeping platform away from the killing cold of the metal. Near the crown, the ragged hole, where the pipe fitting had torn free, still held the outline of the vent rod she had driven through the ice at midnight, while the carbon monoxide closed around her, and Kello's breathing rattled, and the storm reached -40 outside a shelter that no one believed could breathe. The iron alone would have been a coffin. The iron buried beneath still snow, given 2 openings and 1 guarded flame, became the only room on the pass that kept breathing. A mile to the east, the replacement marker pole stands above a featureless drift. Wind crosses the open saddle at speed, carrying snow in horizontal sheets that erase the road and the fence posts and the granite cuts. The drift does not move, the pole does not bend. Below the surface, the iron shell holds its silence, its vents open, its instructions painted on the wall, waiting for the next person who needs a place where the cold cannot reach, and the air still moves. The wind passes over it and finds nothing to strike.